The night was quiet, until it wasn't. A black SUV pulled up outside an empty warehouse, its engine humming softly in the darkness. Inside, James Carter and Olivia Carter had no idea they were walking into a trap. A single text message had led them here. "You want the truth? Come find it yourself." But as soon as they stepped inside, the warehouse door slammed shut behind them. Footsteps, shadows moving. Then, a familiar voice cut through the silence. "James Carter, Olivia Carter. Step outside." James's heart pounded. He knew that voice. Randall Mason, the corrupt officer they were trying to expose, had just turned the tables. And now, they were trapped. Before we start the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new one. The evening air was crisp as Olivia Carter stepped out of her sleek black sedan, adjusting her coat while making her way toward the small cafe on the corner. The city hummed with the usual buzz of traffic, but she was focused on one thing: grabbing a coffee before heading home. She had parked her car near the entrance, right under a streetlight, making sure it was in a well-lit area. Just as she reached for the cafe door, a firm voice stopped her in her tracks. "Excuse me, ma'am," the officer called out, his tone sharp and full of authority. Olivia turned slowly, her expression calm, but the moment she met Officer Brad Mitchell's narrowed eyes, she felt the weight of his suspicion. "Is this your vehicle?" he asked, tilting his head toward the luxury car parked a few feet away. She blinked, momentarily taken aback. "Yes, it is," she said, her voice even. Brad placed his hands on his belt, rocking back slightly on his heels as he eyed her from head to toe. "I'm going to need to see some ID and proof of ownership." A few passers-by slowed their steps, sensing the tension in the air. Inside the cafe, people turned their heads toward the scene unfolding just outside the glass doors. Olivia noticed their glances but remained composed. "May I ask why?" she questioned, keeping her voice steady. Brad's jaw tightened. "Because I asked you to," he said curtly. "Now let's not make this more difficult than it needs to be." Olivia inhaled slowly, pulling out her wallet and handing over her driver's license. The officer barely glanced at it before flipping it between his fingers. "Where did you get this car?" he pressed, as if her answer wouldn't be good enough, no matter what she said. "I own it," she replied, watching his expression carefully. Brad let out a small scoff, shaking his head. "Mind if I check the registration?" he asked, though his tone made it clear he wasn't really asking. Olivia reached into her bag, retrieving the documents without a word. The officer snatched them from her hand, taking his time inspecting them. The longer he stalled, the more people began to notice. A few inside the cafe whispered among themselves, their eyes darting between Olivia and the officer. After what felt like too long, he handed the papers back, but his demeanor didn't change. "Where are you headed tonight?" he asked, his voice laced with skepticism. "Inside," Olivia said plainly, motioning toward the cafe. Brad didn't step aside. Instead, he gave a tight-lipped smirk. "You seem awfully calm for someone being questioned by the police." Olivia's grip on her bag tightened. "Should I be nervous?" He shrugged, taking a step closer. "Depends. People usually don't react so smooth when they've got something to hide." A soft chuckle escaped her lips, though there was no humor in it. "So let me get this straight," she said. "You stopped me outside a cafe, accused me of not owning my own car, and now because I'm not panicking, that makes me suspicious?" His smirk faded. "That's not what I said," he shot back. "But it's what you meant." A small crowd had gathered now, a mix of curiosity and concern in their eyes. Some held up their phones, discreetly recording. Brad noticed and shifted slightly, straightening his shoulders as if regaining control of the situation. "You got somewhere else to be?" Olivia asked, her voice cool but firm. "Or is this how you spend your nights, bothering innocent people?" A flicker of frustration passed over his face. He cleared his throat and glanced around, realizing he had drawn more attention than he intended. Still, he wasn't backing down. "You mind if I check your bag?" he asked suddenly. Olivia let out a slow breath, already knowing where this was going. "Why?" "Just a routine check," he said too casually. She shook her head, crossing her arms. "I don't think so." Brad's stance stiffened. Ma'am, refusing a request from an officer isn't a good look. And neither is abusing your authority, Olivia replied. The air between them was thick, the onlookers frozen in place. Brad exhaled through his nose, clearly growing impatient. Last chance, he muttered, lowering his voice. Olivia didn't flinch. Instead, she pulled out her phone and dialed a number, placing it to her ear. The officer folded his arms, amused. Calling someone to back you up? A small smile touched her lips as she spoke into the phone. James, I need you to come to the cafe. There's a situation here. Brad raised an eyebrow, shifting his weight. Oh, yeah? And who exactly are you calling? Olivia didn't answer. She simply held his gaze, her confidence unwavering. A low murmur spread through the crowd, a few people whispering to each other. The officer, still unaware of what was coming, let out a small chuckle and shook his head. All right, lady, he muttered. Let's see who's so important that you think they can get you out of this. A few feet away, an approaching set of headlights cut through the night, growing brighter as they neared the curb. Brad barely noticed, his focus still locked on Olivia. But the moment the car door opened, the crowd gasped. Brad's smirk disappeared in an instant. The soft hum of the engine faded as the car came to a stop in front of the cafe. The crowd's whispers grew louder as the back door swung open, and James Carter stepped out, his polished shoes clicking against the pavement. His face was unreadable, but his presence alone shifted the energy in the air. Officer Brad Mitchell's posture stiffened as he finally took notice of the vehicle, a government-issued black SUV. His smirk wavered, confusion flashing across his face as James adjusted his cufflinks and took slow, measured steps toward Olivia. Brad's gaze darted to the man's stature, the tailored suit, the undeniable authority radiating off him. Something felt off. His gut told him this wasn't just some concerned husband. Olivia remained perfectly still, her eyes never leaving Brad's face. The officer's fingers twitched slightly at his belt as he quickly tried to reassess the situation. James stopped a few feet away, his sharp eyes scanning the scene. The lingering crowd, the phones still discreetly recording, the uncomfortable expression on the cafe manager's face through the window. Then his gaze landed on Brad, cold and unwavering. Is there a problem here? James asked, his voice calm but heavy with authority. Brad hesitated for the first time that evening. His mouth opened slightly before he quickly shut it, his mind racing. He cleared his throat, adjusting his stance. Sir, this is a routine stop. I was just verifying some information. James's lips pressed into a thin line as he looked at Olivia, then back at Brad. A routine stop? He repeated, his tone giving nothing away. Brad nodded quickly, straightening his shoulders. Yes, sir. She was acting suspiciously near the vehicle, and I was just following standard procedures. A sharp breath escaped Olivia's lips, but she remained composed. James, however, tilted his head slightly, eyes narrowing. Suspiciously? He echoed. His voice remained level, but something in his tone sent a chill down Brad's spine. The officer shifted uncomfortably. Yes, sir, I had to make sure the vehicle wasn't stolen. James didn't react right away. Instead, he studied Brad, letting the silence stretch between them. The officer swallowed hard. Then James spoke again, this time more pointedly. Tell me, officer, what about my wife made you think she stole that car? Brad's eyes widened slightly as the weight of those words sank in. The murmurs from the crowd intensified. People exchanged glances, some raising their eyebrows in disbelief. The color drained from Brad's face as he slowly turned toward Olivia, realization hitting him like a freight train. Wife. James Carter wasn't just anyone. Brad's jaw tensed as he forced himself to meet James's eyes again. Your wife, sir? He repeated, his voice suddenly unsteady. James raised an eyebrow, waiting for him to say something else. The officer stammered, searching for an explanation that wouldn't make him look worse than he already did. Olivia finally broke her silence. I told you before. You didn't believe me. Her voice was calm but edged with something undeniable. Certainty. Brad's mouth opened again, but no words came out. The crowd was no longer whispering. Now they were staring at him, waiting. The officer cleared his throat, desperate to recover. I was just doing my job, sir. I didn't know she was. James took a step closer. The slight movement made Brad freeze in place. That's the problem, James said quietly. You didn't know, and yet you assumed. Brad had no response. He could feel the weight of every pair of eyes on him, watching him crumble under the truth. He suddenly wished he had just ignored the parked car altogether. But it was too late for that now. A thick silence settled over the street as James Carter's words hung in the air. The weight of his gaze pinned Officer Brad Mitchell in place, making it impossible for him to look away. The growing crowd watched, their expressions shifting from curiosity to quiet judgment. Brad's pulse pounded in his ears. He had made a mistake, a big one, but he wasn't ready to admit it. Not yet. Clearing his throat, he forced himself to stand taller. Sir, I was just following protocol, he said, his voice a little too stiff. If I had known who she was, James's jaw clenched slightly. And if she wasn't my wife, he cut in, his voice calm but sharp, would this situation be any different? Brad opened his mouth to respond but stopped himself. His throat tightened. James took another step forward, closing the distance between them. You didn't recognize her. You didn't know who I was. So tell me, officer, what exactly did you see that made you think she didn't belong in that car? Brad shifted uncomfortably, suddenly feeling suffocated under the weight of the moment. Olivia, who had remained composed this entire time, finally spoke. You didn't ask me any questions before assuming I was doing something wrong. You didn't even give me the chance to explain myself. You just decided I was guilty. Brad's fingers twitched near his belt. I never said you were guilty, he muttered, but even as the words left his mouth, they felt weak. You didn't have to, Olivia said smoothly. Your actions spoke for you. A few onlookers nodded, whispering among themselves. The recording phones were still up, catching every second of the conversation. Brad swallowed hard, his mind racing for a way out. He looked at James again, trying to maintain control of the situation. Sir, I was only doing my duty. James's expression hardened. Your duty, he repeated. Tell me, officer, how many other people have you stopped outside this cafe tonight? How many others have you questioned about their own cars? Brad didn't answer. He didn't have an answer. James let out a slow, measured breath. You see the problem, don't you? Brad clenched his jaw, his silence confirming everything. Just then, a new voice entered the conversation. What's going on here? The firm, authoritative tone belonged to Police Chief Daniel Harper. The crowd shifted as a second patrol car pulled up behind Brad's, red and blue lights flashing faintly in the night. The moment Brad saw his superior step out, his stomach dropped. James turned his head slightly, acknowledging the chief with a simple nod. Chief Harper, he said, his tone neutral but firm. Harper's sharp eyes swept over the scene. The uncomfortable officer, the calm but clearly frustrated mayor, and Olivia, standing tall with quiet dignity. Then, his gaze landed on Brad. Mitchell, Harper said, his voice clipped. What exactly is the issue here? Brad hesitated, but James answered for him. The issue is that your officer racially profiled my wife, he stated plainly, and now he's standing here, trying to find a way to justify it. A sharp murmur ran through the crowd. Harper's expression darkened. His jaw tightened as he turned to Brad, his voice low and controlled. Tell me that's not true. Brad felt his stomach twist into knots. There was no way out of this. The video recordings, the crowd, the presence of the mayor himself. He was trapped. He opened his mouth to speak, but for the first time that night, he had no words. The weight of Chief Daniel Harper's stare pressed down on Officer Brad Mitchell, making it clear that there was no easy escape from this situation. The street had fallen silent, the crowd waiting to see how the officer would respond. The phones were still recording, catching every shift in Brad's expression, every nervous glance, every second of hesitation. Brad cleared his throat, his voice strained. Chief, He stopped himself, realizing that no excuse would be enough. His mind scrambled for a way to explain, but nothing sounded right. Not in front of the mayor, the police chief, and a crowd of witnesses. Harper exhaled sharply, shaking his head. You've been on the force long enough to know better, Mitchell. Brad's face turned red. I was just doing my job, he muttered, his voice lacking the confidence he had earlier. James folded his arms across his chest, his expression unreadable. "Then you're bad at it." The crowd reacted immediately. Some gasped, others murmured in agreement. Olivia remained still, her hands at her sides, her eyes locked on Brad. Unlike the officer, she wasn't flustered. She wasn't scrambling. She was waiting. Brad clenched his jaw. "I didn't profile anyone." Harper's head snapped toward him, his expression turning cold. "Then explain yourself." Brad hesitated. He could feel sweat forming at the back of his neck. I I saw her get out of the car, and I didn't recognize her. It's a high-end vehicle. I needed to make sure it wasn't stolen." James let out a quiet chuckle, but there was no humor in it. "So what you're saying is, you assumed a black woman driving a nice car was suspicious?" Brad's mouth opened, but James continued before he could respond. "You didn't check anyone else's car. You didn't stop anyone else. Just her. And now, you're standing here, struggling to explain why." The tension in the air was suffocating. Harper turned to Olivia, his voice softer than it had been with Brad. "Mrs. Carter, I apologize for this incident. I assure you this will be handled appropriately." Brad's stomach twisted. Handled. He knew exactly what that meant. But Olivia wasn't interested in empty promises. She lifted her chin, her voice steady. "I don't need an apology, Chief. I need to know what's going to be done about it." A few people in the crowd hummed in agreement. The energy of the moment had shifted. Olivia was no longer just the victim of an unfair stop. She was demanding accountability, and the people watching weren't going to let this be swept under the rug. Harper exhaled through his nose, giving Brad one last look of disappointment before turning to James. "Mayor Carter, I can assure you, we don't tolerate this kind of behavior on our force." James tilted his head slightly, unimpressed. "Then why is it still happening?" Harper hesitated. He knew better than to offer excuses. Instead, he nodded and gestured toward Brad. "Mitchell, hand over your badge and gun." The officer's eyes widened. "Wait, Chief, Now!" The crowd erupted in hushed whispers, some raising their phones higher to catch the moment. Brad's breath came fast as he hesitated, his hands frozen at his sides. Harper's voice remained calm, but firm. "You've embarrassed this department. You've embarrassed yourself. And you've put us in a situation we should never be in. You're suspended, effective immediately." Brad's entire body tensed. His fingers twitched at his belt, but there was no way out of this. Slowly, reluctantly, he unhooked his holster and handed over his gun. Then, with shaking fingers, he unclipped his badge and placed it in Harper's waiting hand. The cold reality of the situation hit him like a brick. He had started this encounter thinking he was in control. Now he was stripped of everything that made him feel powerful. James stepped forward slightly, his voice low but piercing. "Maybe next time, you'll think before you act." Brad swallowed hard, but there was nothing left to say. He had no defense, no justification, nothing. And as the weight of the moment settled in, he realized this wasn't just about losing his badge. It was about everyone who had witnessed his downfall, the people who now saw him for what he really was. For the first time that night, Officer Brad Mitchell was speechless. The street remained eerily quiet as Brad Mitchell stood frozen, staring at the badge and gun that had just been taken from him. He couldn't believe what had just happened. Moments ago, he had been the one in control, the one giving orders, the one demanding proof. Now, stripped of his authority, he felt exposed, powerless. The murmurs from the crowd grew louder, a mix of quiet satisfaction and disbelief. Some people shook their heads, others whispered to each other, and a few openly smirked at the turn of events. Phones were still recording, capturing every second of his downfall. James Carter let the silence linger for a moment longer before shifting his gaze back to Chief Harper. "Suspension isn't enough." Brad's head snapped up. His heart pounded as Harper turned toward the mayor, a flicker of unease in his eyes. "Sir, I understand your frustration, but—" "This isn't frustration," James interrupted, his voice cool and even. "This is a pattern, and if I hadn't shown up tonight, he would have continued believing he was untouchable." Olivia, who had remained composed throughout the ordeal, finally took a slow step forward. This wasn't just a bad call, she said. It was a deliberate act of discrimination. Harper exhaled through his nose, glancing at Brad, who looked as though he wanted to disappear. James took another step forward. I don't want to hear excuses. I want action. How many times has this happened before? How many complaints have been ignored? Brad's face burned with humiliation. His mind raced. He couldn't believe this was happening in front of all these people, in front of his boss, in front of the mayor and his wife. Harper's jaw tightened. There will be a full investigation. James nodded slightly, unimpressed. I expect results. Brad couldn't stay silent anymore. His voice cracked slightly as he spoke. This isn't fair. I was just doing my job. Olivia's lips curled slightly, not in amusement, but in quiet disbelief. Your job, she repeated. Your job was to protect and serve, not target innocent people. Brad's breathing was uneven now. He felt like the walls were closing in. Harper squared his shoulders. Mitchell, I suggest you stop talking before you make this any worse for yourself. But it was already too late. The damage had been done. A voice from the crowd spoke up. Guess he doesn't like being judged unfairly. A few people chuckled under their breath. Brad's hands curled into fists at his sides. But there was nothing he could do, nothing he could say. James turned toward the people gathered around. Every person here saw what happened tonight. This is why we need accountability, and we won't stop until we get it. A few people nodded in agreement. Some clapped quietly. Brad felt his stomach twist. This wasn't just about tonight. His career, his reputation, had just unraveled before his eyes. Harper placed a firm hand on Brad's shoulder, his voice low but firm. Go home. Brad hesitated for a moment, then turned stiffly, walking toward his patrol car. Each step felt heavier than the last. He could feel the eyes on him, feel the weight of the moment crushing him. As he reached for the door, he paused, taking one last look at the mayor and his wife. James stood tall, his presence unwavering. Olivia, the woman Brad had wrongly accused, remained calm, steady, unshaken. Brad clenched his jaw and got into the car, slamming the door shut. The engine rumbled to life, but even as he pulled away, he knew his problems were only just beginning. The patrol car's tires screeched slightly as Brad Mitchell pulled away from the cafe, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. His heart pounded in his chest, his mind racing with the weight of what had just happened. Suspension, public humiliation, stripped of his badge. He had been reduced to nothing in a matter of minutes. And the worst part? There was no one to blame but himself. Back at the scene, James Carter took a deep breath, turning his attention away from the fading red taillights of the patrol car. The tension that had hung so thick in the air was beginning to shift, but the weight of the moment wasn't lost on anyone. The street was still lined with spectators, many of them shaking their heads, some still whispering among themselves. Olivia remained where she was, standing tall and composed, though James could see the exhaustion creeping into her expression. This wasn't the first time she had faced something like this, and though she had handled it with the same grace she always did, James knew it wasn't supposed to be this way. Chief Daniel Harper finally exhaled, rubbing a hand over his jaw. The way the night had unraveled was far from what he had expected when he had clocked in for duty. This wasn't a situation he could brush off, not with witnesses, not with a recording, and definitely not with the mayor himself standing in the middle of it. Harper cleared his throat before speaking. Mayor Carter, Mrs. Carter, I want you both to know that this department takes incidents like this very seriously. James arched an eyebrow. Does it? His tone wasn't raised, but the sharpness in it was enough to make Harper hesitate. The chief shifted uncomfortably. I understand why you'd be skeptical, sir, but I assure you, an internal investigation will be opened immediately. James didn't break eye contact. That officer felt comfortable enough to harass my wife in broad daylight outside a cafe filled with witnesses. So tell me, Chief, how many others have been treated the same way without anyone watching? Harper had no response to that. He knew James was right, and the uncomfortable truth was, this wasn't an isolated incident. Olivia crossed her arms, her voice calm but firm. This can't just end with a suspension. Harper nodded. It won't. He glanced at the crowd before lowering his voice slightly. But you know as well as I do, procedures take time. James took a slow step forward, his expression unreadable. Make sure that time isn't used to bury this. Harper gave a slight nod. Understood. James turned to Olivia then, his expression softening just a little. Are you okay? She gave a small sigh, her shoulders relaxing slightly. I'm tired, James. Her voice wasn't just speaking of tonight. It carried the exhaustion of years of being judged, questioned, second-guessed, and dismissed. This moment was one of many. James reached for her hand, giving it a small squeeze. Let's go home. But before they could move, a voice called out from the crowd. Mayor Carter! Both he and Olivia turned toward the sound. A young woman, likely in her 20s, stepped forward. She held up her phone, which was still recording, her eyes wide with a mix of anger and admiration. Thank you for standing up to him, she said, her voice slightly shaky. People like me, we deal with this all the time. But most of us don't have someone powerful enough to fight for us. James studied her for a moment. He saw the sincerity in her face, the way her hands trembled slightly as she gripped her phone. He knew what she was saying. He knew the truth behind it. Most people don't have a mayor to call when they're being harassed. Olivia gave the woman a kind smile. You shouldn't need someone powerful to be treated with respect. The woman nodded. Yeah, but the world doesn't work that way. Another person stepped forward, a man in his 40s, dressed in a business suit. She's right. If this can happen to the mayor's wife, what do you think happens to the rest of us? More voices murmured in agreement. Some looked at Olivia with sympathy, others with frustration. James felt the familiar burn of injustice in his chest. He had spent his entire career fighting for change, for equality, for better systems. And yet, even after all the policies, all the work, his own wife had been targeted simply because of the color of her skin. His jaw tightened. He looked back at the chief. This won't be forgotten. Harper gave a small nod. I know. James turned back to Olivia. He could see the quiet storm behind her eyes, the silent battle between frustration and exhaustion. But he also saw something else. Resolve. This wasn't over. And as James and Olivia finally turned to leave, the weight of what had happened settled over the entire street. The people who had watched, who had recorded, who had whispered amongst themselves. They would remember this night. So would the police department, and so would Brad Mitchell. Even if he didn't have his badge anymore, his name, his actions, would not be erased. As James Carter and Olivia Carter made their way to their car, the murmurs from the crowd continued, a mix of disbelief, frustration, and admiration for what had just transpired. Some nodded in agreement, others shook their heads, but one thing was certain. No one would forget this night. James opened the passenger door for Olivia, waiting as she slid into her seat before closing it gently. He took a moment, running a hand over his face as he exhaled deeply. The night had taken a toll on both of them, but he knew this wasn't just about tonight. This was about a problem much larger than one officer and one wrongful stop. As he moved to the driver's side, another voice cut through the night. Mayor Carter! He paused, turning his head. A man in his late 50s, dressed in worn jeans and a button-down shirt, stepped forward. His expression was tight, serious, his brow furrowed. You handled that well, the man said. But what happens now? James tilted his head slightly. Excuse me? The man crossed his arms. What happens next? That officer lost his badge tonight, but what about the next one? What about the ones who don't get caught? A few people in the crowd nodded in agreement. The reality was setting in. One officer being suspended didn't erase the experiences of those who had been through the same thing and never got justice. James studied the man for a long moment before responding. What's your name? Ronald Parker. James took a slow breath. You're right, Ronald. One incident, one officer, one suspension. None of that fixes the problem. Ronald's jaw tightened. Then what will? James stepped forward slightly, his voice carrying over the crowd. Accountability, policy changes, stricter consequences, transparency. But more than anything, we need people like you. People who won't let things like this be forgotten the moment they stop trending online. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Olivia, who had been watching silently, spoke next. This can't just be about my experience. We all know how this works. It happens quietly behind closed doors, in places where no one's recording, and most of the time, the victims don't have a way to fight back. A young man near the front, probably no older than 20, spoke up. Yeah, and even if we report it, nothing ever happens. Harper, who was still standing nearby, shifted uncomfortably. James turned his head toward him. That's why we need real consequences, Chief, James said. Not just for show, not just when it happens in front of a crowd. Harper straightened his shoulders. I hear you, sir, and I know my words probably don't mean much right now. But trust me, this won't get buried. James studied him, searching for any sign of dishonesty. He had worked with Harper for years. The man wasn't corrupt, but he was still part of a system that had protected people like Brad Mitchell for too long. James finally nodded. Make sure of it. Harper didn't look away. I will. James turned back to the people gathered around. This is why it's important to speak up, to hold people accountable, to demand better. One night won't change everything, but it can start something. Ronald sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. I hear you, but I've been around long enough to know talk isn't enough. James nodded. That's why I'm asking you to hold me accountable too. You want change? Make sure I deliver. Ronald let out a short breath. He wasn't satisfied, but he gave a small nod. All right, Mayor Carter, let's see if you mean that. James extended his hand. Ronald hesitated, then shook it. The tension in the air shifted, not gone, but lighter. Olivia exhaled softly, finally turning to James. Can we go home now? James gave her a small smile. Yeah, let's go home. He walked back to the driver's side, slipping into his seat. As the doors shut and he started the engine, Olivia stared out the window, watching as the crowd slowly began to break apart. She wasn't naive. She knew this wasn't the end. Tomorrow the headlines would focus on what had happened tonight. Some would praise James for how he handled it. Others would accuse him of making a spectacle. The police department would release a statement about investigating the matter. And soon enough, another case of racial profiling would make the news. It was a cycle she had seen too many times before. James glanced over at her. What are you thinking? She didn't look at him right away. Instead, she kept her eyes on the retreating figures of the people who had stayed to witness everything. That I don't want this to be just another story people forget. James's grip on the wheel tightened slightly. Neither do I. As he pulled away from the curb, Olivia leaned back against the seat, exhaustion settling into her bones. The night had drained her, but even as the city lights blurred past the window, her mind remained sharp, because deep down, she knew this wasn't over. The drive home was quiet. Olivia Carter leaned against the car door, her eyes staring out at the passing city lights, but she wasn't seeing them. Her mind replayed everything that had happened that night. Brad Mitchell's accusatory tone, the weight of the crowd's silence, the moment James stepped out of that car and shifted the power in an instant. James, gripping the steering wheel a little tighter than usual, kept glancing at her. He knew that silence well. It wasn't exhaustion. It wasn't just frustration. It was the quiet storm that built up every time something like this happened. Finally, he broke the silence. Talk to me. Olivia inhaled deeply but didn't look at him. What do you want me to say, James? That I'm surprised? That I didn't see this coming? James exhaled, nodding to himself. Number, I know better. She shook her head, her fingers tapping lightly against the armrest. That officer looked me in the eye and saw a criminal. I was standing right there, in a well-lit place, doing absolutely nothing wrong, and still, he saw a problem. James clenched his jaw. And now he's suspended. Olivia turned her head, giving him a look. And what does that change? James sighed, slowing the car as they neared a red light. He wanted to tell her it mattered. He wanted to tell her that seeing Brad Mitchell stripped of his badge meant something. But Olivia was right. It didn't erase what had happened. It didn't change how many other people had gone through the same thing and didn't get a mayor to step in on their behalf. She folded her arms across her chest. You know what's going to happen, don't you? James didn't answer. He just waited, knowing she was going to say it anyway. By tomorrow morning, there'll be a statement from the police department. This was an unfortunate misunderstanding. We don't condone racial profiling. We will review our policies. Her voice dripped with exhaustion. And by next week, some other incident will take over the news, and this will fade into the background. The light turned green, and James pressed the gas pedal, his grip on the wheel tightening again. Not this time. Olivia let out a soft, humorless chuckle. I love you, but you can't fix this overnight, James. You can suspend one officer, maybe even fire him. But the system? The way people like him think? That's been built over generations. He sighed, nodding. I know. She looked at him, her voice softer this time. You don't have to carry all of this, James. His hands tightened slightly on the wheel, but he didn't look at her. I do. The car fell into silence again, and for a few minutes neither of them spoke. Finally, Olivia let out a slow breath. I don't want to be a headline, James. I don't want to be the mayor's wife who was harassed. I don't want people whispering about me in grocery stores saying, "Oh, that's her." James looked at her briefly before turning back to the road. I know. And I don't want people thinking I needed you to rescue me. James pulled into their driveway, shifting the car into park but not turning it off just yet. You didn't. She let out a quiet sigh, running a hand through her hair. But that's what people will think? James turned in his seat to face her fully. You handled yourself, Olivia. I just showed up. She finally met his gaze, and for a brief moment, the tension eased. James reached for her hand, threading his fingers through hers. You didn't need me to save you. You never do. But that's not the point. She squeezed his hand lightly. Then what is? His voice was steady, his conviction unshaken. That it shouldn't have happened in the first place. She studied him for a moment before nodding slightly. Number, it shouldn't have. James exhaled, finally turning off the car. Come inside. We'll talk more tomorrow. They stepped out, the quiet night wrapping around them as they walked up to their house. But just as James reached for the door, Olivia's phone vibrated in her pocket. She frowned, pulling it out. A text. Her stomach tightened as she read it. Unknown number. You should be careful. You embarrassed a good cop tonight. She stared at the screen, her heartbeat picking up slightly. James noticed her hesitation. Olivia? She swallowed, then turned the phone toward him. His expression darkened immediately. This wasn't over. James Carter's eyes locked onto the screen of Olivia's phone, his entire body tensing as he read the message again. You should be careful. You embarrassed a good cop tonight. A slow, simmering anger settled in his chest. He had been in politics long enough to recognize a veiled threat when he saw one. His jaw clenched as he exhaled through his nose, his mind already racing through the possibilities. Olivia, however, remained still. Her fingers tightened around the phone, but her face showed no fear, only exhaustion, only the deep frustration of having to deal with this yet again. James took the phone from her hand and scanned the number. No name, no identifying details. Just a cold, impersonal message designed to make her feel vulnerable. But Olivia Carter was not the type of woman who scared easily. She looked up at her husband. So what now? James didn't answer immediately. He was still processing, his protective instincts battling against his logical side. He knew one thing for certain. This message was not random. Someone had watched tonight's events unfold, and they weren't happy about it. Someone wanted them to stay silent. Finally, James let out a slow breath, his voice calm but edged with steel. We report it. Olivia's lips pressed into a tight line. To who, James? The police. She let out a bitter laugh. You really think that's a good idea? He knew where she was coming from. This wasn't just some internet troll making baseless threats. This was deliberate. This was someone inside the system. James placed a reassuring hand on her arm. We don't just let this slide, Olivia. She sighed, rubbing her forehead. I never said we would. He could hear the exhaustion in her voice, and he hated that she had to deal with this. He hated that she had to be the one targeted just for existing in her own city. But before he could say anything else, her phone vibrated again. Another message. Unknown number. Don't make a mistake, Mr. Mayor. Some things are better left alone. James inhaled sharply, his fingers tightening around the phone. Now it was directed at him. He looked up at Olivia. She didn't flinch. She didn't panic. But he saw something shift in her expression. Not fear, determination. She was done being a target. Olivia reached out, taking the phone back from James. With a deep breath, she typed a response. Olivia Carter, you should be careful. You embarrassed yourself tonight. Then without hesitation, she hit send. James smirked slightly despite the situation. That's my girl. But as they stepped inside their home, both of them knew this wasn't over. The people who sent that message weren't just angry. They were connected. They had influence, power, and the arrogance to believe they could intimidate the mayor and his wife into silence. James walked into his home office, immediately pulling out his phone. He scrolled through his contacts, landing on the name he was looking for. Detective Marcus Ellison, a man he trusted, a man who had spent years dealing with cases of corruption within the police force. He pressed the call button, waiting as the phone rang. After a few seconds, a deep voice answered. Carter, what's going on? James glanced at Olivia, her arms crossed as she leaned against the doorway, watching him carefully. I need to talk to you. Now. There was a pause, then Marcus responded. This about that officer you shut down tonight? James's grip on the phone tightened. It's bigger than that. Another pause. Then Marcus let out a slow breath. I'll be there in 20. James hung up and turned to Olivia. We're not letting this go. She nodded. Good. But deep down she knew whoever sent that message wasn't bluffing. And the closer they got to the truth, the more dangerous this was going to become. The weight of the night pressed against James Carter as he stood in his home office. Phone still in his grip, his thoughts racing. The message Olivia had received wasn't just a random act of intimidation. It was a warning, a reminder that powerful people didn't like being challenged. He turned to see Olivia Carter standing in the doorway. Her arms crossed, her face unreadable. But James knew her too well. Beneath her composed expression, he could see what she wasn't saying. She wasn't scared. She was furious. You should get some rest, he told her. She let out a short, humorless laugh. Rest? She shook her head. James, someone just threatened us. I don't think sleep is on the agenda tonight. He sighed, running a hand over his face. I know, but we can't let them see that this rattled us. Olivia stepped forward, placing her phone on his desk. Did it rattle you? James looked her in the eyes. No. She studied him for a long moment before nodding. Good, because it sure as hell didn't rattle me. Before James could respond, the sound of a car pulling into their driveway caught both of their attention. Olivia moved toward the window, peeking out through the curtain. A sleek, dark-colored sedan came to a stop. A moment later, Detective Marcus Ellison stepped out, his expression grim as he adjusted his jacket. He's here, Olivia said. James nodded and made his way toward the door, opening it before Marcus could even knock. The detective stepped inside without hesitation, his sharp gaze sweeping over both of them. Tell me everything, Marcus said without preamble. James motioned toward his office, and the three of them moved inside, shutting the door behind them. Marcus sat down across from James, his eyes flicking to Olivia before resting on the phone sitting on the desk. I'm assuming that's the problem? He asked. James handed him the phone, and Marcus's brow furrowed as he read the messages. His jaw clenched slightly. Damn, he muttered. He scrolled for a moment, his mind already working through the possibilities. Numbers blocked. Could be a burner phone. Could be routed through a third party. He glanced at Olivia. You didn't respond, did you? Olivia lifted her chin slightly. I did. Marcus's eyes widened, and James sighed. Yeah, she did. The detective let out a low whistle, shaking his head. Damn, Olivia. You really don't make my job easy, do you? She shrugged. Whoever sent it wanted to see if they could intimidate me. If I didn't respond, they'd think I was scared. Marcus gave her a long look before nodding. Fair point, but next time, let's not poke the bear. James leaned forward, his elbows resting on his desk. What are we looking at, Marcus? Who do you think is behind this? The detective exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. Could be a lot of people, but let's start with the obvious. Brad Mitchell. Olivia frowned. You think he sent it? Marcus shook his head. Number Brad's a hothead, but he's not this calculated. He lost everything tonight. His badge, his reputation. He's probably drowning in self-pity right now. But that doesn't mean someone else isn't looking out for him. James's jaw tightened. Someone higher up. Marcus nodded. Exactly. Think about it, James. That officer was way too comfortable harassing Olivia in public, in broad daylight. That means he wasn't worried about consequences. And if he wasn't worried, it's because he thought someone had his back. Olivia leaned back in her chair, her mind working. You're saying there's a system protecting guys like him? Marcus shrugged. I'm saying the rot goes deeper than one bad cop. He tapped the phone. And whoever sent this? They don't care about Brad Mitchell. They care about the fact that you made an example out of him. You embarrassed the wrong people. James exhaled sharply. Then we're not just dealing with one officer. We're dealing with a network. Marcus nodded. And they don't like when people like you disrupt the system. Silence settled over the room as the weight of those words sank in. James glanced at Olivia, his mind already made up. We fight this. Marcus smirked. Yeah, I figured you'd say that. But listen to me. This isn't just about standing up in front of cameras and giving a speech about justice. This is about power. And people with power don't go down without a fight. James met his gaze without hesitation. Then we fight smarter. Marcus studied him for a moment before nodding. All right, but if you're serious about this, we do it my way. Olivia folded her arms. What's your way? Marcus leaned forward, lowering his voice. We don't just react. We investigate. We find out who's behind this message, who's protecting officers like Brad Mitchell, and we expose them. James's eyes darkened. And then what? Marcus's smirk returned. And then we watch them fall. Olivia exhaled, glancing at James. You really want to go down this road? James reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. I don't see another option. Marcus stood, stretching slightly. Then buckle up, Mayor Carter, because you just stepped into a much bigger fight than you realize. James didn't flinch. He was ready. But what none of them knew was that the people they were up against were already watching, already planning, and they weren't going to let James and Olivia Carter win without a war. The weight of the conversation settled between James Carter, Olivia Carter, and Detective Marcus Ellison like an invisible storm cloud. The air in the room felt heavier, charged with an unspoken understanding. This wasn't just about one corrupt officer. It was about an entire system built to protect people like him. James stood up, pacing the length of his office, his mind running through every possible scenario. He knew what Marcus was saying was true. If Brad Mitchell had felt comfortable enough to target Olivia, in public, without hesitation, then that meant one thing: he wasn't acting alone. Someone had given him that confidence. James turned back to Marcus. Where do we start? Marcus leaned against the desk, his expression unreadable. We start by following the money. Corruption in law enforcement doesn't exist in a vacuum, James. There's always a trail: promotions, donations, favors. If there are people in power protecting officers like Mitchell, they're not doing it out of the kindness of their hearts. There's always a financial incentive. Olivia folded her arms, her gaze sharp. And you think you can find it? Marcus smirked slightly. I already have an idea where to look. He pulled out his phone, scrolling for a few seconds before turning the screen toward them. A name flashed across it. Deputy Chief Randall Mason. James felt his jaw tighten at the sight of the name. Olivia exhaled sharply. Mason? You think he's involved? Marcus nodded. Think about it. He's been in the department for over 2 decades, and in all that time, he's done nothing to address misconduct. Every single complaint that's landed on his desk against officers like Mitchell, it's either disappeared or been dismissed with insufficient evidence. James ran a hand over his face. He was at the last police reform meeting I held at City Hall. He sat there and told me face to face that there's no systemic problem in this city's police force. Marcus chuckled dryly. Of course he did. He doesn't think it's a problem because he's one of the people benefiting from it. Olivia frowned, leaning closer. Do you have proof? Marcus sighed, locking his phone and sliding it back into his pocket. Not yet, but I know where to start digging. James exchanged a glance with Olivia before nodding. All right, we go after him. We pull records, look at past complaints, financial statements, Anything that connects him to covering up misconduct. Marcus smirked. Glad to see you're catching on. But before anyone could say another word, Olivia's phone buzzed again. Another text. Her stomach clenched as she picked it up. The previous messages had been from an unknown number, but this one had a name attached. Randall Mason. James and Marcus leaned in as Olivia tapped the message open. Randall Mason. You and your husband need to tread carefully. Some things aren't worth the fight. James inhaled sharply. His grip on the desk tightened as a slow, burning anger coursed through him. Marcus let out a low whistle. Well, that didn't take long. Looks like we rattled the right cage. Olivia, however, remained unnervingly calm. Her expression didn't change as she stared at the message. She wasn't afraid. She was furious. She lifted her gaze to James and Marcus, her voice steady as she spoke. Then it's time we hit back. James nodded. Agreed. Marcus cracked his knuckles, his eyes gleaming with something dangerous. All right then, let's make them regret sending that text. The fight had just escalated, and now it was personal. The tension in the office felt suffocating as Olivia Carter, James Carter, and Detective Marcus Ellison stared at the message on Olivia's phone. Randall Mason. His warning wasn't subtle. It was a direct challenge. James exhaled through his nose, his fury barely contained. He's not even trying to hide it. Marcus smirked, but there was no humor in his eyes. Of course not. Guys like Mason, they think they're untouchable. They think a few veiled threats will be enough to make us back down. Olivia tapped her fingers against the desk. They don't know who they're dealing with. Marcus crossed his arms. They will soon. James sat down, rubbing his temples. We have to be smart about this. If we move too fast, he'll cover his tracks. Marcus nodded. We're not going after him blindly. First, we gather everything we can. Look for patterns, connections. If we can tie him to covering up misconduct, that's one thing. But if we can prove financial corruption, he whistled low. That's a different kind of bullet to the chest. Olivia frowned. You think there's money involved? Marcus scoffed. Come on, Olivia. Mason didn't rise through the ranks protecting dirty cops out of the goodness of his heart. There's always money somewhere. Maybe backdoor deals, maybe political favors, maybe pressure from donors. We just have to find it. James leaned forward, his eyes darkening. And once we do? Marcus smirked. We bury him. A heavy silence filled the room. Olivia finally spoke. Then we don't waste time. Where do we start? Marcus pulled out his phone again, scrolling quickly. Mason's been at this for years, but the most recent complaints he's handled personally? He turned the screen toward them, revealing a list of names. All involve officers accused of excessive force or racial profiling. And guess what? Every single case was dismissed. James clenched his fists. How many? Marcus exhaled, looking at the number at the bottom of the report. 52 in just the last 5 years. Olivia's stomach turned. 52 complaints. 52 people who tried to fight back and got shut down. James shook his head. Not anymore. Marcus scrolled further. There's something else. Some of the officers involved in these cases, they were promoted shortly after. James's eyes narrowed. Mason rewarded them. Marcus nodded. Looks that way, and you're not gonna like this next part. He tapped on one of the names. Brad Mitchell. Olivia inhaled sharply. You're telling me Mason promoted the officer who harassed me? Marcus nodded. Brad wasn't some rogue cop acting on his own. He was part of a bigger system, and Mason made sure he stayed protected. James's anger boiled over. Then we take this public. Marcus raised an eyebrow. Not yet. James frowned. Why not? We have proof Mason covered up complaints and promoted bad cops. That's enough to destroy him. Marcus leaned in, his voice lower. No, James, it's not. Not yet. He looked between them. If we go public now, what happens? Mason calls it a political attack. Says you're smearing the department because of what happened to Olivia. He plays the victim, his allies in the force circle the wagons, and by next week, it's forgotten. We don't want headlines, James. We want a takedown. James exhaled sharply. Then what's the plan? Marcus smirked. We make Mason sweat. We dig deeper. We find something even worse. And when we finally go public, his grin widened. He won't be able to recover. Olivia leaned back in her chair, tapping a finger against her chin. And in the meantime, Marcus's expression darkened. We wait for him to make a mistake. James nodded. All right. But when we go after him, we do it right. No half measures. Marcus stood, stretching his arms. Good, because trust me, by the time we're done with Mason, he tucked his phone back into his pocket. He won't just lose his job, he'll lose everything. But just as he finished speaking, Olivia's phone buzzed again. Another message. This time it wasn't a threat, it was an address. James frowned. What the hell is that? Olivia's pulse quickened as she read the message. Unknown number. You want to know the truth? Come find it yourself. Marcus grabbed the phone, reading it over. His smirk disappeared. Looks like someone wants to help us. James's stomach twisted. Or lead us into a trap. Marcus exhaled. Only one way to find out. Olivia met James's gaze, her expression unreadable. What do you want to do? James stared at the screen for a long moment before making his decision. We go. And just like that, the game had changed. The atmosphere in the room shifted the moment James Carter made his decision. We go. Those two words carried a weight that none of them could ignore. Olivia Carter exhaled slowly, her grip tightening around her phone. A part of her knew this was a risk, walking into the unknown, following a message from someone they didn't trust. But another part of her, the part that refused to be intimidated, knew they had no other choice. Marcus Ellison studied the address on Olivia's screen. His eyes flickered with both curiosity and caution. This could be a setup, James nodded. I know. Marcus rubbed his jaw. Then why are we doing this? James's expression was firm. Because if there's even a chance that this leads us to the truth, we have to take it. Marcus let out a slow breath, shaking his head. All right, but we do this on my terms. I don't like walking into situations blind. Olivia raised an eyebrow. And what exactly are your terms? Marcus smirked, though his expression remained serious. First, we don't all go in. One of us stays back as the lookout. Second, I'm bringing a weapon. He turned to James. And third, if anything feels off, we walk away. No hero moves, no stubborn speeches about justice. We get out. James hesitated for a moment but nodded. Agreed. Marcus grabbed his jacket. Then let's move. The drive to the location was tense. The city lights blurred past as James navigated through the streets, his mind racing with possibilities. Olivia sat in the passenger seat, glancing at her phone every few seconds, half expecting another message. Marcus followed behind them in his own car, his focus razor sharp. He had been in law enforcement for too long to trust situations like this. Anonymous messages rarely led to anything good. The address led them to an old abandoned warehouse near the outskirts of the city, the kind of place no one paid attention to. James pulled into the parking lot, killing the engine as he scanned their surroundings. The place was eerily quiet. Marcus parked a few feet away, stepping out cautiously. He scanned the area, hand resting near his holster. This looks like the beginning of a bad crime movie. Olivia ignored the comment as she stared at the building. The windows were either shattered or boarded up, and the metal door looked rusted from years of neglect. James turned to Marcus. You stay outside, keep watch. Marcus narrowed his eyes. You sure about that? If this goes south, I'd rather be inside than out here waiting. James shook his head. We need someone watching our backs. If something happens, call for backup. Marcus exhaled, rolling his shoulders. Fine, but the second I hear something off, I'm coming in. James nodded before turning to Olivia. You ready? She let out a small, determined breath. Let's do this. They approached the door cautiously. James tested the handle. It was unlocked. He exchanged a glance with Olivia before pushing it open. The inside was dimly lit by flickering overhead bulbs. The place smelled of dust and old wood, the air thick with neglect. Footsteps echoed in the distance. James tensed. They weren't alone. A shadow moved near the back of the warehouse. Then a voice. Took you long enough. James and Olivia turned toward the sound, their eyes narrowing as a figure stepped into the light. A man, mid-40s, wearing a dark coat and jeans, with a look of quiet calculation in his eyes. James took a cautious step forward. "Who are you?" The man smirked slightly. "Someone who doesn't like Mason any more than you do." Olivia crossed her arms. "Then why the secrecy? Why send a cryptic message instead of coming to us directly?" The man let out a short laugh. "Because I'm still alive, and I'd like to keep it that way." James clenched his jaw. "You have something on Mason?" The man nodded, his expression darkening. "I have everything, but I need to know that if I hand it over, you'll actually do something with it." Olivia exchanged a glance with James. "That depends. What exactly do you have?" The man took a slow breath, then reached into his coat pocket, pulling out a flash drive. He held it up between his fingers. "This is 20 years worth of corruption, payoffs, cover-ups, bribes, and a whole lot worse. And Mason, he's at the center of all of it." James's eyes locked onto the flash drive. "Why give this to us?" The man's smirk faded. "Because I spent years working under Mason. I saw things I can't unsee. And when I tried to speak up," he let out a bitter chuckle. "They buried me." Olivia's voice was careful. "And now you want revenge?" The man's expression turned cold. "I want justice." James took a slow step forward, his voice steady. "Then hand it over." The man hesitated for a moment before finally extending the flash drive. James reached for it. Then the warehouse door slammed open. A rush of cold night air flooded in as Marcus stormed inside, his gun drawn. "We need to go. Now." James's stomach dropped. "What? What happened?" Marcus's face was tense. "We're not alone out here." James turned back to the informant. "Who else knows about this meeting?" The man's expression darkened. "If someone followed you, then we don't have time for questions. Take the drive and run." James didn't hesitate. He snatched the flash drive from the man's hand, gripping it tightly. Then from outside, the sharp sound of approaching footsteps, multiple. James's pulse spiked. Olivia inhaled sharply. Marcus turned toward the door, his stance defensive. Then, a voice rang out from the darkness. "James Carter. Olivia Carter. Step outside." James's stomach dropped. He recognized that voice. Randall Mason. They had walked into a trap. The warehouse air grew thick with tension as Randall Mason's voice echoed through the open doorway. "Step outside, Carter. Let's talk like men." James Carter's grip tightened around the flash drive. His mind raced. This wasn't just a threat. It was a message. Mason had been watching them. He knew they would come here, which meant someone tipped him off. Beside him, Olivia Carter inhaled sharply, her fists clenched at her sides. She had spent years dealing with men like Mason, powerful, arrogant, untouchable. But tonight, he had made a mistake. He had underestimated them. Marcus Ellison took a step closer to James and Olivia, his voice low and urgent. "We don't have the numbers to fight this head-on. We need an escape plan." James nodded, his mind shifting into strategy mode. "How many?" Marcus peeked through the broken window near the entrance. 3 officers, maybe more. All unmarked cars. They're not here as cops, James. They're here as Mason's cleanup crew." The informant, the man who had risked everything to get them that flash drive, let out a slow, bitter laugh. "You think Mason's stupid enough to come alone? He brought men who don't wear body cameras. Men who will make sure none of us leave here breathing." James exhaled, his jaw tightening. "Then we don't let them trap us." Outside, Mason's voice grew sharper. "Don't make me repeat myself, Carter. You don't want this to end badly." James's pulse pounded in his ears. They were running out of time. Option 1, fight. Option 2, run. James had spent his entire career confronting corruption, but this wasn't the city hall floor. This was an ambush. Olivia met his gaze, and in that single look, they both understood. Survival came first. Exposure would come later. Marcus was already moving. He pulled out his phone, typing fast. "I'm sending our location to my contact at Internal Affairs. If we go missing, they'll know where to start looking." James nodded. gripping the flash drive like a lifeline. Back door? The informant shook his head. Mason's got this place surrounded, but there's a maintenance tunnel under the storage room. It leads to a drainage exit 2 blocks down. Marcus didn't waste time. Then that's our way out. James turned to Olivia. Stay close. She gave him a look. I wasn't planning on wandering off. Before they could move, the sound of approaching footsteps grew louder. Then, bang, bang, bang. Mason pounded on the warehouse door. Enough games! Either you come out or we come in. James exhaled sharply. They were out of time. Marcus was already pulling the informant toward the storage room, Olivia close behind. James took one last look toward the door before following them, his every instinct screaming to move faster. They reached the back room just as the warehouse door slammed open. Go, go! Marcus urged, yanking open a metal grate in the floor. Below, a dark tunnel stretched into the unknown. The informant was the first to drop in, landing with a grunt. Olivia followed without hesitation, sliding down and disappearing into the shadows. James crouched at the edge of the tunnel, but before he could jump, he heard it. Mason's voice dangerously close. I want them alive. Then, gunfire. A deafening crack filled the warehouse as bullets struck the walls, sending debris flying. Marcus cursed, ducking low as James pushed himself down the tunnel, landing hard. Above them, Mason's men stormed into the back room. James scrambled to his feet. Move! The tunnel was tight, damp, reeking of rust and sewage. Footsteps pounded above them. Mason's men were searching. Olivia's breath came fast beside him, but she was focused, determined. Marcus, ahead of them, led the way, his phone flashlight barely illuminating the space. It should open up just ahead. James glanced back, just as shadows passed over the tunnel entrance above. They weren't safe yet. Then suddenly, a light appeared. The end of the tunnel, their escape. Marcus reached it first, pushing open the heavy grate. Let's go! The informant climbed out first. Olivia followed. James was halfway up when a hand grabbed his ankle. His stomach lurched as he was yanked backward. From above, Mason's voice echoed. I warned you, Carter. James's fingers scrambled for a grip. His mind screamed. Olivia, Marcus, the flash drive. They had to get out. Then, a gunshot. The grip on his ankle loosened. Mason's man collapsed with a groan. James twisted around to see Marcus, gun still smoking. Move! Marcus barked. James lunged for the exit, dragging himself out of the tunnel just as Marcus kicked the grate shut behind them. They were out. But the fight? Far from over. The cold night air hit James Carter like a slap as he stumbled onto the pavement, his breath coming fast. Behind him, Marcus Ellison kicked the heavy metal grate shut, sealing off the tunnel just as the sound of Mason's men grew louder inside. They had escaped. For now. Olivia Carter grabbed James's arm, steadying him. Are you okay? Her voice was calm, but he could hear the unspoken panic beneath it. James nodded, wiping his brow. I'm fine. His grip tightened around the flash drive. And we got what we came for. The informant was already scanning the empty alley around them. We need to move. Mason isn't the type to let this slide. Marcus pulled out his phone, quickly texting something before shoving it back into his pocket. I just sent our location to my contact at Internal Affairs. We need to disappear before Mason's guys figure out where this tunnel leads. James inhaled sharply, already thinking 2 steps ahead. We go to City Hall. We get this into the right hands before they have time to cover their tracks. But Olivia shook her head. No. James frowned. What do you mean, no? Olivia turned to Marcus. If we give this to Internal Affairs now, Mason will know exactly where to strike. He'll send his men to destroy the evidence before it can be processed. We need to make this public, all of it. Marcus sighed. She's right. If this stays inside the system, it dies in the system. James ran a hand down his face, considering their options. The flash drive in his hand felt heavier than it should. It wasn't just evidence. It was power. And Mason? He wasn't going to stop until he got it back. James looked at Olivia. What are you suggesting? Olivia exhaled, glancing around as if searching for the right words. We don't just leak the story. We make it impossible for them to hide. A press conference. Right in front of City Hall. Cameras, reporters, witnesses, everything. We show the city what Mason has been doing, and we make sure everyone sees it before he has the chance to bury it. The informant let out a low whistle. That's bold. Marcus gave a dry laugh. That's suicide. But James, he was already nodding. That's exactly what we need to do. Marcus groaned. I hate it when you two agree on things. James turned to Olivia. How soon can we set this up? She didn't hesitate. First thing in the morning, we take this public at sunrise. Marcus rubbed a hand over his face. Fine. But until then, we lay low. Mason's men won't stop looking for us tonight. James glanced down the alley, his instincts on high alert. We have a safe house. We stay there until morning. Olivia gave a tight nod, her determination unwavering. Then let's move. As they slipped into the shadows, James knew one thing for certain. There was no turning back. By this time tomorrow, Randall Mason's empire would begin to crumble. And this time, there would be nowhere left for him to hide. If you think justice was served, hit that like button and let us know your thoughts in the comments. Do you believe people like Mason should be held accountable? Share this video so more people can see the truth. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories like this.